Well, wonderful. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining the Scaling Up Community of Practice Education Working Group webinar on scaling Edtech solutions. It's a bit of a mouthful. Please use the chat functions to tell us your name, affiliation, and location. My name is Gail Simon. I am a technical director with the education practice area at MSI, and I am co-chair of the education working group for the Scaling Up Community of Practice. I am pleased to facilitate this webinar with Jenny Perlman, my co-chair for the education working group and a senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. We are joined by Molly Weiss, a senior research analyst at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, and Natalie Colangelo, a project manager at MSI. I am hoping that we will have Larry Cooley of MSI and Johannes Lin of the Brookings Institution with us today. They are the founders and co-curators of the Scaling Up Community of Practice. We have three wonderful panelists with us today. Mary Burns is a Senior Technical Specialist at Education Development Center, EDC. Caitlin Moss Coughlin is a Senior Program Officer at R4D, Research for Development, and an Engagement Manager at Edtech Hub. And finally, Helen Nemesi, who is Head of Design at Educate. Our panelists will discuss their experiences implementing EdTech solutions and implications for scaling up, particularly when trying to reach the most marginalized populations. Our panel discussion will last about 40 minutes and will be followed by 30 minutes for questions and discussions. And finally, we will have a wrap-up session and information sharing session about upcoming events from the Scaling Up Community of Practice. Please use the chat function to ask your questions and make your comments. During the Q&A period, I will call on some of you to unmute and ask your questions, or I may also just happily ask them away for you if that is preferred. Until then, unless you are a panelist, I think it would be preferable if you would remain on mute, but also turn off your videos. So thank you very much. And now I will turn it over to Jenny.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gael. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. As Gael said, I'm Jenny Perlman Robinson with the Brookings Institution, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to co-chair this session with Gael. I just want to say a big thanks to Gael and to Molly and Natalie for organizing this. So this theme really emerged quite organically, as a number of you might recall from many of our conversations we've had within the education working group. And in particular, it builds on a session that we organized last April that was really on the heels of folks responding quite rapidly to COVID-19 and schools, many schools, most schools shutting around the world. So it's really, I think, quite exciting to come back together and to reflect a bit in terms of, well, what have we learned in general, but certainly over this past year and a half. So as Gael said, I have the pleasure to ask a few questions of our distinguished panelists. And then I will turn it back to Gael for her to open it up for conversation with you all. Questions, comments, and other insights certainly that you all have to share. So maybe I will begin by starting with Mary. And by way of just a brief introduction, I know Gael introduced her by name, but just to say a few words about her incredibly impressive resume. Mary Burns is a senior technical specialist with the Education Development Center. She's a highly regarded specialist in teacher professional development, online learning instruction, curriculum development, and educational technology, EdTech. Mary's work has traversed every level of the education system, from policy development to program design and implementation to directly supporting teachers in the classroom. She herself was a teacher for many years, and she's worked in every continent. Mary, as you will know, is not only a practitioner, but also a researcher and the author of numerous books and blogs and articles including, I might just put a plug out there, Mary, for hot off the press, a background paper that Mary authored for the 2023 Global Education Monitoring Report, which, if you don't know, the 2023 issue will be on educational technology. So quite opportune, and this background paper was just published earlier this week. So I think maybe we'll go ahead and put the link after in the chat box for those of you. I'd highly recommend taking a look at it. So Mary, it's a pleasure to have you back. You joined us last April as part of that conversation as we were all sort of whirling and responding to the rapid closures of schools around the world. And at that point, we were really discussing how schools were being forced to move further into the direction of online learning and utilizing Edtech. And yet we're all aware of the huge variations in terms of what children have had access to and certainly what they've been learning. So I suppose my question for you is, where do you see the most potential right now for Edtech to contribute to scaling quality learning opportunities, and in particular for those most disadvantaged learners?
Well, first of all, thank you for all having me, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, I mean, so ideally, educational technology can provide access. It can provide quality education, and it can provide equity. The problem is that there's a lot of dependencies in order for this to happen. So for access, people have to have, they have to have electricity, they have to have infrastructure. For quality education, that's a lot about design, and I think we'll be talking about this later. Sometimes the design may interfere with the ability to scale. And there's a whole issue, of course, that we all know is equity, and we've seen this a lot during COVID. So ideally, if infrastructure is in place and people know how to use it, then ideally any educational technology, you can scale any of it. But the reality is that that's not true. And we've seen this in COVID because 826 million children, if I believe that number is correct from UNESCO, were not able to access education over the past year at some point. So, in terms of which technologies, what we've really seen during COVID, I think the two really stand out. And one is television. It really has had kind of an educational renaissance. 79% of the world's population has access to a TV. There is an urban-rural divide, but what we know, and I'm sure Caitlin knows much better than I, is that we know now that there is high-quality educational TV programming, especially for children. So the variations of Sesame Street, programs like Ubongo Kids, which was developed in Tanzania, and programs like Akili and Me. And I think the second is another old technology. COVID was the resurgence of old technologies, and that second old technology, and one which my organization has a lot of expertise in, is radio. And there, about 90% of the world's population has access to a radio. And if you use interactive radio instruction, where you combine activities and songs and very scripted teacher lessons with radio, we have a long body of research there showing that radio can actually reach the most marginalized kids, but more important, it addresses that issue of equity. So children who go through radio programming, whether they're boys or girls, rural or urban, in some of the most marginalized places on earth, can actually get access to a quality education.
Thanks for that, Mary. And, I recall, again, when we met in April, you mentioning how we're going to need help from some old friends, right? Yeah. Such as radio and TV. And in fact, as you found, that's really been the case, despite the fact that I think oftentimes when we hear EdTech, we automatically think of high-tech digital technology. But to your good point, there's a rich body of evidence and long experience with a number of these technologies that have been and can be quite effective. Can I pick up on one comment you made about alluding to maybe perhaps some of the tensions between designing some of these educational technologies and then on the other hand, looking for sustainability and scalability? Could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, and So Natalie, you might have to give me the hook at this point, so I'll try to be succinct. I mean, if you look at online learning, for example, which is the technology that I know best, or the distance technology, which is, I think, what I'm talking about right now. If you have the kind of online learning that works well is that has good research behind it, that shows it's not only effective, but also that people don't drop out, which is critical for online learning. That's synchronous learning, teacher-led learning, or synchronous courses, teacher-led courses, and cohort-based courses. So those are harder to create and scale. And when I say create, because you really have to prepare your instructors, you have to really pay attention to different types of pedagogy. A lot of it is live and synchronous through something like Zoom, and there's a lot of fatigue associated with that. It's bandwidth intensive, et cetera, et cetera. The kind of online learning design that's easier to scale is asynchronous. So it's students learning at the different times at different places. It's not teacher-led, so you're essentially on your own, and it's self-paced. So that's easy enough. You can scale those things. That's what MOOCs are. But the problem there is that those kind of courses have extraordinarily high dropout rates. So yes, you can scale them, quote unquote, but you have to be prepared for attrition rates that can be, 90% and above in a lot of open universities and in MOOCs. So I think that's the tension. The tension, at least in online learning, is that if you want quality and completion, it conflicts with really the ability to scale and to make courses that are less expensive.
Thanks for that. I'll be interested, Caitlin, later to turn to you and see if you have any reflections on that based of the evidence gathering and research that you've done. Must it always conflict? Is there sort of a sweet spot that we might be able to find between designing for effectiveness, as you said, and also being able to reach some type of scalability? And then there's a whole equity dimension as well, which I know we'll touch upon. But maybe I'll turn over to you, Helen, if I may. Helen Nemesi is the design and initiatives lead for Educate in Uganda and joining us from Kampala right now. She leads strategy and planning for Educate, where she works with a team of experienced curriculum designers to provide oversight on quick and rapid experiments through product learning loops that yield proven solutions for youth empowerment at the school level. Previously, Helen was a senior school coordinator in Eastern Uganda. So with our panelists, we have quite a bit of frontline, if you will, experience here. So Helen, if I could just begin, it would be great if you could just give us a brief overview on Educate's impressive work, and in particular, the role that technology has played in scaling some of your impacts.
Right. Thank you so much, Jenny. I'm happy to see everyone here, Mary, Caitlin. So Educate has been doing so much, and for those that are new to our organization, our purpose is to prepare youth in Africa with the skills to succeed in today's economy. So that's the goal of designing solutions that are measurably impact millions of youth across Africa each year. So since 2009, we partnered with youth, schools, and governments in Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya. And we are currently, I would say we are currently the biggest youth skill provider in East Africa. Before COVID, we're impacting over 46,000 youth each year. So to dive a little bit more on the topic of today, when COVID closed schools, we had to adopt to create a condensed long-distance version of our proven in-school experience model. So before, we had a program that we're delivering directly in school. And so when COVID hit, we had to really, kind of rethink how that program is delivered. So we have actually experimented in various ways, that how can we support our youth to access the programs while they are learning from home, schools are closed, COVID is here. And so we tried radio, and Mary, later on, I would really love to hear a lot around the impact of radio for the youth, but we did experiment on radio and phone-based tech. And so in 2020, as a result, we're able to reach 100,000 students by October. But most importantly, we're able to do that through low-tech, I would say, approaches. We currently use just a basic feature phone to actually get these lessons to our youth. And so we've been able to, how can I say it? We've been able to leverage like the low-tech that is available to us to enable the youth in the program actually access these virtual lessons. I think later on we'll really talk more a lot about how that functionality works. But just to probably talk a little bit about our components. So in brief, we have a program that we call the Virtual Innovation Program, or VIP in short. And so it has our peer mentors lead you through the virtual transferable and entrepreneurship skills training that includes just a few brief components. So one, we do develop skills through the remote-based course. And again, as I said, this is delivered through phone and SMS. We do have virtual mentorship, and this takes place in group mentoring sessions, again through phone. And then we assess skills, youth skill development and practical application. So we do require them to submit practical evidence of their work for us to be able to know that they've been able to apply their knowledge. And we do that through SMS and also the quizzes. And mainly this is again still via SMS, but that functionality is able, you can ably get that even on a basic feature phone. So that's what we've been experimenting with. We've done some pilots on radio, on the robocalls, but I guess we'll later dive into that. But just briefly about what Edtech has been doing. Thank you, Jenny.
No, thanks so much, Helen. Really fascinating to hear. I had the privilege to visit some of Educate's programs in Uganda, and I was struck by how critical the human interaction component is and that experiential component. And I can imagine the challenges, as you said, of transitioning to a sort of online digital.
Definitely transitioning to from a purely in-person model to like a virtual model. As Boris puts it, it threw us out of business, right? And so we had to really scramble into a product development process to actually start building a new product that we could actually, deliver to youth, because we knew there was like so much potential. All the youth were home, and I think because of COVID and all these other, things that have been taking place, most households have actually either have access, like Mary says, access to a television or radio or a phone. So we've been really trying to tap into that space to engage youth even during this time when schools are closed.
And maybe just one follow up there is I'm struck by your role at Educate in terms of these quick feedback learning loops. And we know that really central to scaling is this need to iterate and adapt and course correct based on data and learning. And so, wonderful if you might speak a little bit more to what have been some of the key learnings coming out of some of those quick learning feedback loops around these technological adaptations.
We've done lots of research, we've done lots of pilots, we've done lots of prototypes. I think the first thing we did try again was radio. We did try radio, we did try robocalls, we did try, getting youth into WhatsApp groups for them to be able to access either content or be able to do a reflection from the radio episodes. And so again, it just really speaks to our, how can I call it? It really speaks to our, agility to be able to create a product really quickly. So we're able to, run surveys, call youth, really do a lot of research for specifically the Uganda market to see what technologies were available to us. And so we did try radio in 2020, but ultimately we had to stop doing radio. Because one, it was extremely costly, and then second, and that's something that I want to hear from Mary later, is being able to assess the impact of radio on the youth, and being able to tie that really being able to tie the impact, and you're very sure that the youth who listen to your program are actually able to translate that into some sort of action. So we also did try WhatsApp groups, but ultimately, we also had to stop doing that because internet is not accessible to all. We have taxes on data here in Uganda, and so it has also hindered the youth from accessing, let's say, smartphones or just having access to internet. So what has worked for us after all those small prototypes and, building all these things is actually the basic, I would say, smart feature phone or a basic phone. So our youth mentors are able to connect to the youth by using the conference call functionality on a phone. And so one user can connect up to 5 people. And then if you do have another person on the call, they can actually also connect up to 5 users. So a lesson can actually take place with 20 youth on a call using a basic functionality of a conference call. So after going through radio, robocalls, and whatnot, we actually landed on it's not our invention because it's on a phone, but we actually realized that having a conference call was the most effective and the most efficient way that we could deliver our content to our youth.
That's great. Thanks, Helen. And I know Bram just had a clarification. Could you just say what a robocall is?
So a robocall, I may not be a very tech person, but a robocall is an interactive voice response. So how best can I put it in the? So a robocall is you do record like your voice, whatever content you want to pass along to the youth, and so you'd use a medium. So we would get a service provider where I would load those recordings, and so would time or set the recordings to go out at a certain time. Most times it used to be before the radio episode, so we'd do recorded robocalls to alert them that, oh, there's going to be a radio episode happening at this time. So that is set out to go automatically. So once that is set out, the call just comes directly to your phone, and you're just able to listen into a robot, I would say, but it's a recorded voice. And so would be able to either alert them that a radio episode is coming up, or after a radio episode would send out a robocall to either get their reflection or get them to do an assessment. So it's it's an interactive voice response kind of functionality.
Great, thanks. Well, and thank you, Helen, for your question to Mary. I'd love to circle back in a moment, Mary, if you might share some thoughts around the impact of radio and some of what Helen was mentioning, some of the challenges of assessing what's the impact of listenership. But Caitlin, I'd love to move over to you right now. So again, as Gael introduced, Caitlin Koflan is the Education Manager of the Edtech Hub and a Senior Program Officer at R4D. You must be a superhero, Caitlin, because I can't manage one job, let alone you manage two. But Caitlin specializes in supporting change agents to use evidence to inform education decision-making. At R4D, she's worked on education issues, including access high-quality education for out-of-school children, youth skills and employability, scaling innovations, and now most recently, EdTech. With her EdTech Hub hat on, Caitlin runs the help desk, which I'm super excited to hear about, a service providing just-in-time evidence-based advice on EdTech. And I understand, Caitlin, and you'll say much more, this includes to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK government and World Bank educational staff, but I imagine others as well as part of the EdTech Hub's 8-year research program to build evidence in this space. In her role at the help desk, she reviews education policy and program documents. So again, I think we're very fortunate to have you here. So maybe just to begin, Caitlin, would you give us an overview of the EdTech Hub and the critical role that you all are playing in generating evidence in this space?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jenny. And it's been great to hear Mary and Helen's reflections so far. So just to introduce the work of EdTech Hub, it is really a global nonprofit research partnership that was initiated by FCDO, the World Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's led by R4D and 5 other organizations. And our goal is to generate evidence on effective uses of EdTech in low and middle income countries. And then also to make sure that innovators and policymakers have the evidence and the support that they need to make informed decisions on EdTech. Now, just by happenstance, EdTech Hub was being set up as a program right around the time that the pandemic hit, and so it's been a busy couple of years for us. We are really focusing on the intersection of EdTech with a handful of education topics, including teacher professional development, personalized learning, girls' education, data-driven decision-making, and participation in education. And the bulk of our work is in 6 countries, 2 in West Africa, so Sierra Leone and Ghana, 2 in East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania, and then 2 in South Asia, Bangladesh and Pakistan. And we're taking a couple of different approaches and kind of ways of coming at those topics, ranging from commissioning and conducting research to technical assistance and this rapid response help desk that focuses on engaging decision makers. And then finally, we also are really doing something similar to what Helen was talking about in terms of that kind of iterative, adaptive, and feedback loop type approach, which is what we call sandboxes. So really working with innovators and implementers to test and scale their interventions. And so those different approaches are deliberately engaging different parts of the scaling ecosystem, if you will, and where we can, trying to bring those different actors together. And we know that sometimes the different ways in which they work can be part of the set of challenges and obstacles that we face to scale. So with the help desk in particular, I'm happy to say more about how that works, but it really is, so SCDO, education advisors, World Bank, education staff, and now actually UNICEF country and regional offices who are working very closely with ministries of education and coming to us with their EdTech related questions and challenges. So I've had a lot of fun playing the role of what I like to think of as air traffic control, kind of seeing everything that's coming in and trying to match make with what else is happening in the hub in terms of our research and our work with innovators, and getting them the best kind of examples and evidence in the moment that they need it to try to make a decision about the design of a policy or program or related to challenges that they might be facing in implementing that. So that's a little bit about the hub, and maybe I can stop there and hand it back to you, Jenny.
That's great. Thanks, Caitlin. Be really curious to hear, what are some of the top challenges that you're hearing across the board?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the things that we've seen a lot during the pandemic is that this is a moment where everyone's attention has turned to EdTech because of school closures, because in-person and face-to-face learning just isn't possible in many parts of the world. And with that, I think governments are really eager to build out solutions that work now, and be able to support learners as much as possible, but also to even think ahead and expect that this might not be the last major disruption to education that we're going to face. And so I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is, how do you both develop solutions and put in place plans and policies and programs that work now, and also ones that can work later? And I think Mary and Helen have spoken to the importance of broadcast media and low tech, which we've also seen. And in addition, I think one of the areas where I'm excited for sort of what's happening is solutions that work offline as well as online. So they might be designed to work with connectivity and electricity when it's available. And then when it's not, they're still able to function and provide learning resources for kids and their teachers and their families.
That's great. And I'm curious whether, related to some of those challenges you shared or elsewise, have there been any sort of big ahas that you've had, sort of big takeaways, and sort of both sifting through the evidence that we have, or the evidence that you're generating, the discussions that you're having with these national decision makers, sort of any sort of surprises or big ahas that have come out?
It's a great question. I think one sort of aha, in a way that maybe we're all experiencing together in this moment, is that because that face-to-face learning has been so limited, we're in a moment where the role of parents and caregivers in education is just more important than ever before. And so their attitudes and their mindsets matter a lot. And so there's 2 examples from our work on sandboxes where I'm seeing this play out a little bit. And one of those is with our partners at DeafReach, who we've been working with in Pakistan to test the use of laptops and smartphones to support deaf learners. And on parent engagement, they had found that parents were falling prey to common misconceptions about their children's cognitive abilities. and building trust and empathy with them was really crucial to their Edtech interventions working, if you will. And so they have set up a couple of different ways of really engaging with parents and trying to empower them to support them in understanding their children's needs. And I think we've also seen that in Kenya, where we've been working with some wonderful partners, the Keep Kenya Learning campaign and the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development, really finding that caregivers' confidence and their digital literacy were two important factors as to whether parents were supporting learning at home. And so finding ways, including SMS messages and resources to support their digital literacy skills have been really key.
Thanks for that. And maybe as I circle back to our other panelists, in addition, I'd love Mary to turn back to you and Helen's question around radio, but also, would be interested to hear on Caitlin's last point, how, if we're thinking about scaling EdTech solutions, the critical roles that parents and caregivers have played and will certainly in the future continue to play, and any sort of thoughts, experience, or research that you've seen around that. So Mary, can I turn it back to you?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I guess, Helen, in terms of what you're doing, EDC has done a lot of radio work. It kind of made its name on radio. A lot of that is around basic education. So you're doing vocational ed, which is different, and I would assume older students. And so I think that assessment challenge is a big one, because it sounds like you'd have to be trying to do it at distance. Is that correct? So, and then, with basic education, it's pretty easy to assess because you can use the EGRA, you can use the EGMA, and there's a really defined set of skills around numeracy and literacy. I think one resource that might be interesting for you is USAID. Earlier this year in January, published a guide on assessing distance education modalities, and the author of that is Emily Morris, who's at American University. And it also, I think, Anna Farrell, who's at Encompass. It was created by Encompass. But we can also trade emails afterwards, and I could maybe connect you to the right person at EDC. In terms of the second question, Jenny, in terms of the role of parents, it's interesting because in the United States in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of virtual schools and online schooling. And it's, so there's issues around this. One of the issues is around the quality of the teachers and how much those teachers are paid and how many students those teachers have. So parents have actually been subsidizing. In a way, what happens then is that when you have virtual sort of homeschooling, as we've seen, the parents become these unpaid teachers. So there's kind of an ethics question around that, I guess. But there's no question that the role of parents is extremely important, and this gets back to that whole equity issue again, because if you have educated, active parents, then you're going to do better than children who don't. And it doesn't mean that parents don't care. I'll use the example of mine. My parents were immigrants, and they were poor and uneducated, and they were terrified of school. So they never went to a parent-teacher meeting, and that wasn't because they didn't care. It was because they were so intimidated by the teachers, who actually happened to be nuns. So, but there's some, on the heels of just doing this work for UNESCO, there's some really interesting research that Noam Angrist, whom I'm sure folks on this call know, looked at in Botswana with phones, just reaching out to parents and actually asking questions, but also giving them some advice. And there's very good research around that. And the San Francisco Unified School District for the last several years has actually run something similar, a program that's also similar, where every week they call parents and they give, so it's for children who haven't gone to school yet, and they give them parenting tips about just preparing for school. And I don't know what those tips are exactly, but it's there was just a big randomized controlled trial done maybe 2 years ago that showed a lot of important learning effects for these kids compared to parents who didn't get the phone calls. And one more study that I read that was really, really interesting was, and I can't remember, I want to say this is New York City, but it was a Chinese community where parents didn't speak English, so the schools sent home cards that were written in, whether it was Mandarin or it might have been Cantonese, because the immigrants were from Fujian province, but it was how to work with your children at home, and it was written in the language that the parents spoke, and that also proved to be very, very successful. So I guess there are ways, we've seen during COVID and even before that, of course, we need parents. We've seen this throughout history, I'm sure. And then there are ways to do outreach with technology and non-technology to actually help those parents, help their students succeed in school.
Thanks for that, Mary, and for those resources you mentioned. I think after this meeting, we can send around an email with some of these links. And we have actually colleagues at Brookings, Rebecca Winthrop and colleagues, who are just releasing a playbook on parent engagement, not specific to educational technology, but certainly touches that. So anyway, that's really helpful. Maybe my last round of questions for maybe Helen and Caitlin before we open it up to conversation is just returning to this question of equity. And so, Helen, maybe I'll start with you. I know equity, and in particular, gender equity, is very central to Educate's work. And I'm interested to hear in sort of the use of EdTech, if you have examples of where you've actually seen EdTech mitigating some of these inequities rather than exacerbating, which I know we've heard and seen quite a lot of. Or potential, let's say.
Yeah, potential. Thank you so much, Judy. I think I'll admit that's an area that I think we're still doing like lots of more research, not for only Educate, but I guess for all the other players, because I think when it comes to equity, there's so many unleveled grounds, right? To speak to our aha moment, we actually did realize that boys actually had their own phones as compared to the girls. And so we had to build in like flexible scheduling to allow the girls be able to attend the calls probably later in the evening or very early in the morning before they start their chores. But again, it just really goes to the role of parents or caregivers. And so our general messaging to the parents, when we're starting the program, we actually get a female mentor to call the parent to encourage them to allow the girls access their device. So it's not really about like coming into that space and being able to fill that void or something like that, but it's really working with the players like around this person or around this gender to be able to break some of those gender barriers or those equity barriers. So yeah, as I mentioned, the boys have phones as compared to the girls. And really, we do need to do like lots of research in terms of how can we access technology, how can the girls, be able to, to attend these sessions or be able to engage as much as the boys. But yes, our intervention right now has been get a female mentor to call the parent before the program starts and really explain the benefits of the program and really leverage the parent's either device or knowledge, whatever it is, to help the girl access that. Otherwise, even in my house, I would be freaked out if my daughter started getting random phone calls. I'd be like, "Who is that calling?" So, so it's very important that we plug in that parental engagement. But in terms of like the equity, yes, we've seen definitely the boys have more access to internet. They have access to phones. They have access to they even probably they've subscribed to more social media sites as compared to the girls. So it's just really again playing around with the strategy of the caregivers, the parents, and really encouraging them. I had to go on radio where we're recruiting girls for our virtual innovation program, and I had to manually go to radio and really speak about why it's important for the girls to access the phones and really telling them like that the program is very beneficial. So when a mentor calls, kindly as a parent, access your girl, support your girl to access a device, and they'll be able to listen into these sessions. So, but lots of research needs to be done in there, and maybe so many interventions that need to come in play.
Thanks, Helen. Caitlin, maybe over to you on that note in terms of what some of the research you're seeing around some of that additional type of planning and preparation that Helen's speaking to that needs to happen in order to try to address the equity challenges.
Thanks, Jenny, and really great to hear Helen's reflections on this. I think what Helen has said is fairly consistent with what we're seeing in terms of research and examples. I'm thinking about some of the requests that we've gotten through the help desk, which sometimes include kind of zooming out more to the ecosystem level and looking at, what is the landscape of different edtech solutions and innovations in a given country or context. And what we're seeing with some of those examples is that in some cases, the sort of marketplace of edtech solutions is just not that well designed to meet the challenges of marginalized learners. And that could be for various reasons and incentives that innovators and implementers might have. But I think the key is that those that are working really well tend to do what Helen was just describing and really think about the human elements of what is needed, and really get creative around things like connectivity, working offline, using media, broadcast media, or hardware that those communities already have access to overcome some of those barriers. And so I guess what I would say there as well is that we're seeing that there are different forms, obviously, of inequity and of marginalization. And sometimes there are greater differences sort of within a country than there are even across, right? So major cities in a set of countries might have much more in common than they do with rural areas. And so that's where I think when we're talking about scaling and sort of the potential for these edtech innovations and solutions to spread, sometimes we actually need to be thinking about that happening across communities, across countries, where there may be more similarities in the needs of marginalized learners than differences.
Thanks, Caitlin. And I think a great segue as well to this community of practice and really the opportunity, as you're speaking to really share across countries where maybe one might think contextually we have less in common, but in fact, as you're pointing to, within countries, there's quite some similarities. Across the countries in terms of what they have in common. So with that, I could spend the next hour asking you many more questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Gael to open it up to you all. And I think if folks either want to raise their hand digitally using the little icon at the top of Teams, or just put something in the chat box. Molly and I can help Gael moderate the chat box during the conversation. So thanks, over to you, Gael.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was quite informative. I don't see any questions yet or raised hands, but I do have a question, so I guess I'll launch it. Actually, no, Larry Cooley has a question, so I'll pass it along to Larry first. Larry?
I didn't mean to jump in front of you, Gael, but
there
was a silence and I took it. First of all, thanks to everybody. I learned a ton. I mean, really, I'm so appreciative of the conversation. I have two questions that you touched on, but I'm hoping you can go one step further. One is one that Jenny raised early on about the trade-off or the tension that Mary mentioned between things that scale easily and things that seem to be most impactful. And Jenny asked the question, but nobody quite answered, whether there might be a sweet spot as to where and how those things come together. And I'll abuse the privilege and ask a second one that's really not, maybe it links, but it may not, which is that a lot of this attention has been focused and driven by the COVID situation. But I'm wondering, hoping for the day when that's no longer the dominant feature of what we're doing, how much of what people have done in extremis they would choose to keep and basically just see it as kind of forced innovation, but innovation nonetheless, not just problem solving. And I'd be interested, for example, in anything you found on that, but I'm especially interested, Helen, in terms of the things you've had to do in response to this situation when it's over, when COVID's not the driving force on this. How much of it do you think a group like Educate would choose to keep as part of their new model of how to do this sort of thing? Thanks so much.
Would you do I respond or Jaelo coming through?
Please go ahead, Helen.
Yeah, so that's a very good question in terms of finding the, as you call it, the sweet spots between scale and impact. But I think, for us, for Educate, we are really most excited to use, this technology that we've, researched and piloted on and, learned from, and we're thinking about scaling it in 2 ways. So first is through education systems. And so that's the first one is for out of school. So we have an out of school program that we launched last month. So for out of school, we are hoping that the technology can actually help us engage the youth. We see lots of potential as well as recent evidence breakthroughs to build experiences that allow all, and I think I can't stress this more, like all students to get some sort of post-primary education, even if they cannot access the traditional secondary school. So we are taking like these results that are proven, and we are supporting curriculums for bootcamp kind of platforms. And so we want to learn from what we have done internally from our, we're calling it the Virtual Innovation Program, and we're building on those technologies to leverage for the out of school. So if we can access the in-school youth through, again, the conference calls and these low-tech technologies, that is something that we want to be able to push to the out of school youth programs, because again, for out of school, it's more disruptive. The ground is even worse leveled, I would say, than for in school. So we want to really leverage most of the technologies that we are using for in school to be able to reach the out of school youth. So the last one maybe that I would talk about in terms of how we would leverage that is through the education system. So currently we're partnering with Rwanda Education Board, and we're working to fully institutionalize a policy change we created around impacting more practical and continuous skill-based assessment. So we are developing that system with the government, and this is going to allow teachers to easily upload grades to a central system using, again, a basic phone technology. And so this tech will allow us to integrate, or the teachers to integrate grades from their regular classes that aligns to or feeds into for the students for the national exams. And so teachers will be able to access the system or be able to upload these marks or these scores using a basic phone. So we are really taking a lot of what we've learned from the process in 2020, piloting this and taking those lessons and trying to really scale them into our education system, as I mentioned, and also our out of school youth program. I hope that answers your question.
And Larry, I'll jump in because I think your first question was about my comment about online learning. And the 2 poles that I mentioned, the synchronous versus asynchronous, et cetera, are not as dichotomous as I make them out to be. So there is a continuum of online learning, and what we've learned in terms of COVID is that online learning is like the virus itself, rapidly mutating. So there are all different kinds of variations of online learning. So I think you can, have a continuum of online courses with some degree of synchronicity and asynchronicity. You can't do everything synchronously because it's just logistically impossible, and it's also exhausting and bandwidth intensive. But so for example, you can give teachers scripts, etc. But you can have kids work asynchronously, but they're working with other students, etc. But I think there's things that you can't get away from that we've seen are critical in COVID. And number 1 is, design matters. But number 2 is that preparing teachers to teach online matters a lot. And that's something that historically we have neglected in online learning. It was kind of the any warm body would do. And it's very hard to teach online. I find it extremely hard to teach online. And I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm going to teach a course later next month online, and I'm already terrified about it. And I've been doing this for 20 years, and parts of it will bomb. And I've been doing this for 20 years. I keep going back to this. So I think that the preparation of teachers, but also the preparation of learners, because the one thing we have learned during COVID is that these kids, they are digital natives for the stuff they love to do. They are not digital natives for things that are hard to do. So they may have good operational skills and know how to use the technology, but that doesn't mean that they have good strategic skills with technology or informational skills with technology. And you know, one of the biggest predictors of success in online learning is essentially a set of personal characteristics, like self-regulation, self-control, you know, being goal-oriented. And so those are things that we actually have to prepare learners to do, because all across the United States and some of the poorest cities, kids just disappeared. You know, we've seen across the world that we see from the research that the poorest students and the students in poorer versus wealthier countries do worse in online learning than students in wealthier countries. We've seen that women do worse. We've seen that online learning has really exacerbated this existing Matthew effect that we see with educational technology, and it reproduces a lot of the inequalities that we see in the education system at large. So yeah, there is this continuum that I think we can get to, but I still think there's a lot of work around it that needs to be done before we actually can scale online learning, especially as easily as we think we can.
If I could just jump in as well on Larry's question about sort of forced innovation and how much of that people might keep. I think it's a really interesting question, Larry, so I'm glad that you posed it. And from my perspective, I guess what I'm seeing is that return to education, if you can really call it that at this point, because the pandemic has been ongoing for so long. But if we are returning to some semblance of face-to-face and in-person learning, that's going to be a real challenge. And so to the extent that a lot of, not all, but many of the innovations that we're seeing have focused around how to keep teachers and learners and parents engaged in education, I think that those are actually going to be very important in terms of thinking about then how to bring kids back into the classroom when that's possible. And I think Mary makes a great point just about really thinking about the skills that teachers are going to need and sort of what the future looks like there. And I think we're learning not only about what those skills are, which include definitely better equipping them for blended and hybrid learning models, but also even how to use technology in their professional development process as well. So the way that I see it, I think that, you know, a good bit of this forced innovation, if you will be important and impactful as we move into a future that maybe looks more blended or hybrid going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Larry, for your question, and for the panelists for the answers. Wondering if anybody else has a question, if they would like to raise their hands. So as people are oh, absolutely, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Serhiy Kovalchuk. I'm with the International Development Research Center. Thank you very much for an excellent panel, and it has been great to listen to you. To some extent, you have answered my question, but I want to ask to go back to this topic about cautionary tales about Edtech. You have talked about, exacerbation of inequalities. What other cautionary tales you have seen and we should be aware, especially if we want to scale innovations, if we can just round up some of those things?
Who would like to go first? Caitlin, go ahead.
Sure, I can start, and I'm really interested to hear what Mary and Helen and others in this group have to say on this question too, because I think it's a great one and maybe one that we don't talk about enough. I think with EdTech, there can be this perception that technology is just a silver bullet, right? And you throw tech at the problem. And so I would say that's the biggest cautionary tale, and maybe that's one of the key takeaways from the discussion that we've had today, is that doesn't work. And it really is thinking about a lot of the human components of what is needed surrounding a specific piece of EdTech hardware, but also the quality of the content, which I know Mary has spoken to a lot in terms of the importance of design, that I think are so important. So I can think of examples of, program documents or policies that I've reviewed where there's so much more attention given to the specifications of a specific piece of EdTech hardware. And that is important to think about. It has, real implications for implementation, but sometimes the attention given to that is far, far greater than the attention that's given to the pedagogy or the design, or really thinking through how are humans in the world going to kind of interact with this. And so that would be my push and my sort of cautionary tale, if you will.
In terms of cautionary tales, it's interesting as we've gone online. So we have to recognize that when students are online, they are interacting with big commercial platforms, for-profit companies for the most part, and there's or these EdTech unicorns. I mean, COVID's been a boon for the EdTech industry. There are now 28 unicorns, educational technology firms worth more than $1 billion. It's just a booming business. So when we're online more, we are creating more user data, whether deliberately or not deliberately. And these companies are taking that data and they're using it sometimes to improve learning for the student, to personalize learning and adapt learning. Sometimes they're plowing it into their own systems to make them better, but many times they're selling them to one party who sells to another party who sells to another party. And this is with MOOCs. And so, our favorite universities who run MOOCs, and this is with commercial platforms. So in scaling online learning during EdTech, we've also scaled the bad components of educational technology. So we have a lot more students whose data is at risk, whose privacy at risk. They're kind of guinea pigs for these social experiments. They are not deriving any monetary benefits from the data that is gathered about them and sold. But as schools are online around the world, they're also storing more of their own information in the cloud, and Amazon Cloud, et cetera, Azure. And I don't think, so Caitlin, here's a project for the EdTech Hub. I don't know if this is causally related, but we are just seeing a ton of ransomware attacks. And a lot of them are against schools because they're very, very vulnerable. So I think that is one cautionary tale. I think a second cautionary tale is the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, because we are increasingly, because we are online, we are losing our ability to read long, complex bodies of text. Andreas Schleicher talks a lot about this, but I've seen this in my own work. I can't put a document online. If I do, I have to bullet it. It's got to be 2 pages long. And this is for maybe people who have PhDs that I'm working with, university folks in other countries. So I think this inability this accessing more and more information, a lot of which is inaccurate, a lot of which is deliberately inaccurate, and then the inability to differentiate between truth and falsehood. And that's every age. And I think we're seeing the repercussions of this. And then, I think the third thing, there's really interesting research being done about kids and their phones and kids and social media. And I know this is in the background paper for UNESCO. I think the research is named Twente. There's a lot of great stuff that comes out of the Netherlands. And controlling for every single factor, age, income, location, depression rates among youth have been increasing since 2012 all over the world, at very, very high rates. And it is the one absolute link is the amount of time spent on social media. So I think those are 3 kind of cautionary tales, at least around the online component of educational technology. You asked for cautionary. We can talk about good stuff. Let's just kill the conversation. Put a damper on things.
Thank you so much.
Caitlin's getting on this.
No, this was very, very informative, and I think right to the point. So thank you so much. Helen, did you want to intervene as well?
Sorry, I cut out. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Mary, were you through? I don't want to cut you short.
Oh, yes, I'm through. Sorry.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit on what Caitlin and Mary said. Yeah, so for us, I think we also must focus on like the individual youth and the impacts and really understanding the user experience. And so my biggest lesson from the last round of the bootcamp that we did implement was that you just can't get something that is trendy or that is working elsewhere and you just, sort of like try to replicate it. So being very cautious around how, again, your user will interact either with the system or how they will perceive it. So to give an example, we did try a gamification strategy that flopped big time. So it's like one of the lessons that I'm actually taking away from that experience. But generally, we did design this, big system where the youth could actually track their own, individual learning, or we had a point system. So if they would attend a session, they would send in a keyword to a system, and then the idea was that the system would then populate or tabulate for them their points, and then that would, flow into graduation. The thing that I learned was before you roll out like something so, again, trendy or fancy like that, you probably need to see it work multiple. Much as it can be like an exciting, tech space or tech innovation, taking a little bit of a step back to actually understand how the user will interact with the system over time. What does that mean for even in terms of cost? Just to again focus on that individual youth and how the program is impacting them, as opposed to, coming up with something that just either helps you see participation rates or see how they're engaging with the system. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, like don't copy and paste. Don't copy and paste. That's one big lesson that I've learned. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Helen. Any additional questions for our panelists? As people are thinking about their questions and their comments, I just wanted to ask about issues of equity around children with disabilities. Caitlin, I know you mentioned a program in Pakistan working with children who are deaf, and Mary also talked about exacerbating the inequalities inherent in the education system. And so I'm wondering, not only the use of Edtech solutions, but also the scaling up. So what are some of the good practices around that for children with disabilities, but what are also some of the difficulties?
Caitlin, you want to go?
Mary, you go first and I'll come in after.
So yeah, assistive technologies is something I have rather pedestrian knowledge of. So I wouldn't be able to answer the last question at all. Technology is absolutely vital for kids who have disabilities, and really it's a lifeline to helping students, visually access content, hear content, use a computer, etc. I mean, it helps kids essentially get an education. So that part of it is extremely powerful. Where the issues are that I understand is, number one, is around research, that there's not a lot of great research on assistive technologies. In some cases, they've been kind of taken as sort of a given. Number two is that there's, even in wealthy contexts, there's not a lot of planning for, say, universal design and planning for accessibility. Rather, it's a let's buy this thing and that thing and the other thing and then put it there without a particular plan. Because you really have to, this has to be part of a careful, deliberate design. And the third thing, as I understand it, is that it's hard to scale so there's a lot of accessibility features that are built into a lot of the tools that we use. So Google Docs, Google, Microsoft, I do online learning design, so I use Articulate 360, and everything is, there's a lot of accessibility features there, but it's often hard to scale them then with existing assistive technologies because for the companies who create the stuff that most of us use have particular agreements with one assistive technology company versus another. So their features work on those devices, but they don't scale across to other devices. And I'll stop there. We've just taxed the extent of my knowledge.
I will also say that I'm not an expert on disability, but Edtech Hub has done a systematic review of research on EdTech for disabilities in low and middle income countries. And one of the headline findings from that review was exactly what Mary just said, which is that there really isn't enough research on this area. And I think USAID has also done some really great work on universal design for learning and EdTech. And there's a resource that I can recommend on that as well. I would say, consistent with what Mary was just describing, kind of the procurement of devices, whether those are assistive and sort of exactly what they look like, oftentimes gets really de-linked from individual learners' needs. And so I think it's really important that as much as possible, sort of those learners and their communities are brought into that process and have a say, and their needs are well understood by the people who might be procuring specific devices. And then, yes, that issue of kind of interoperability as well, I think is huge. And finally, teachers being well equipped to actually support learners to use those devices, or in some cases, parents, in the example that I was talking about earlier with Deaf Reach, that can be a real challenge as well. So not only just having the technology available, but actually having the child and the people who are supporting their learning be familiar with and comfortable with that technology as well. And I think for all of those reasons, it can be a challenging area to really scale, but it's one that I think we as an education community have to be very deliberate about in order not to exacerbate by just sort of rolling out other interventions at scale that don't meet the needs of these learners.
Yeah, I think to add a little, to what Caitlin said, same as me, we're not really experts in the disabilities, and this is something we're still learning in the virtual learning space, but we've seen some evidence of siblings supporting those with disabilities or impairments. For instance, a young man with a vision impairment was able to participate and create a small business selling charcoal briquettes. So I would say it's like naturally happening, but this is an area probably we can continue to learn more from other research.
I'm going to add one more thing about this, which is, if there's one device that's really been a boon for children with learning disabilities and children with physical disabilities, it's the tablet. There is research showing that kids do the tablet, just because of its design, it has a hard keyboard, a soft keyboard, all these things, that you can attach a hard keyboard, and it's just multimodal because of the apps. It's highly visual. It's just been a real boon for young children and also for learners with disabilities. And what's so interesting about learners with disabilities is that they're really power users of technology because they need it to actually get an education, to communicate, to hear, etc. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Any other questions for our panelists? Yes, Margarita, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Margarita from IDRC, KICS. So yes, please disregard the question if you discussed it before, because I joined the meeting late. So, but I heard the part you mentioned about women, gender issues, and the relation with technology, the use of technology. So my question is more related to the fact that you are in the general scope. We are saying, okay, if we have more female teachers in secondary education, for example, it's so important to ensure access of girls and that girls stay really in the education system, in secondary particularly. So my question is regard to the use of technology. If you know about specific initiatives, successful initiatives that have, for example, supported female teachers, like really for their teaching work, etc., particularly in secondary level, but maybe not only that. And if there has been like a direct effect on the use of technology by girls, by students, like related with this use of technology by teachers and the relationship with the user and understanding and learning improvements from girls in the system. So just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarita. Who wants to start?
I can start by saying thank you, Margarita, for the question. You know, the majority of teachers are women. So certainly at the early childhood, primary, and then in most countries at the secondary level, though you start getting more men at the secondary level and then the tertiary level. So I guess I'd argue that, you know, if you do high quality professional development around technology that incorporates technology, you are benefiting female teachers, because women, the last time I looked, were like about 63% of the teaching workforce globally. We do know that girls and boys, that there are gendered uses of technology. So boys, and this cuts across most countries with a few exceptions. So for example, gaming, most boys, not most boys, gaming is predominantly a male field. There's exceptions to this, like Bulgaria, but mostly what we see from the research is that boys tend to like to use technology for things that are competitive, like gaming, and the girls like to use things for like collaboration, etc. So there are these gendered ways of using technology, and I think the thing that we have to do is you know, so the big thing in assessment now is game-based assessment, because you can look at a lot of social emotional skills and work readiness skills and higher level thinking. But I'm thinking, I don't know, is that going to really disadvantage girls who don't like gaming? And perhaps there could be another form of assessment that's designed for them. It's interesting because the technology field is, it's very, very male driven. So we create products, they're products created by men who like to do certain things, and you know, we see these throughout the education system. So I'll stop there.
I have an addition and hopefully a complement to what Mary just said. I think it sort of indirectly gets at your question, Margarita, but I was thinking back to a rapid evidence review that some of my colleagues conducted on girls' education. And one of the findings of that was that teachers have misconceptions about girls and technology. And so, you know, they sort of have these, some of them have these biases that girls aren't good with technology and they might not enjoy using it. And so that's sort of the other side of the coin of what Mary was just saying, of a lot of this, you know, the reality is that it is very male dominated and sort of not designed for girls and women. But I think sort of moving towards, okay, well, what do teachers need and what do girls need? It is really counteracting some of those biases, right, in the way that teachers are supported to do their jobs and probably in their own level of comfort. So I haven't seen research on sort of female teachers' use of technology as compared to male teachers' use of technology, but I'm interested to look because of the question that you asked. Mary might know more about that though. Thanks.
I think to also add a little bit before we move forward. So I've seen mainly this at a government policy level. For instance, in Rwanda, most of the schools have tabs, but in terms of how the teachers are interacting with that technology to either support girls or boys equally to access that, probably that is not data that I have. But yes, again, for Uganda, it really depends on a school and how they can, either leverage whatever they have, either maybe get resources to build a computer laboratory and support either the teachers to access some materials or even the students. So for Uganda particularly, and also Rwanda, we don't have like lots of research around how the teachers then use that technology or use that to help the youth access resources. For our virtual bootcamp, we don't interact lots with teachers, but again, the world is changing. I would say COVID has changed the world, so probably as we progress to like a more tech future, maybe that is something we can learn around.
Great, thank you very much. We are almost at the end of this Q&A session. I'm wondering if there's one last question. Okay, then thank you very much, everyone. Jenny, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Gael. I'm going to pass it to Molly to help wrap us up and talk a little bit about what's next. But as long as I am on video for a moment, I just want to take a moment to really thank our panelists. It was a fascinating conversation and so grateful for you sharing your time and expertise. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely, thanks so much. So just to wrap us up in the last few minutes, I wanted to share sort of next steps and upcoming events. So today's slides and recording will be available on the Scaling Up Community of Practice website, so others can have a chance to look at them as well. For those of you on the line who maybe are not yet members of the Education Working Group, we definitely encourage you to sign up on the website so that you can receive updates and invitations to our future events. I can put that link back in the chat. It's free to join. Of course, you're also welcome to join other thematic working groups as well. On that point, the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group is holding a webinar next week in collaboration with the working groups on health and education. And the webinar is examining cases of large-scale interventions in education and health, illuminated by deep dives into the scaling of two major interventions, one being the expanded use of community health workers and one being teaching at the right level. So this webinar will be on September 20th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, and it's one actually in a series of webinars that's been probing issues and options related to measuring and evaluating institutionalization. And this one on Monday specifically will highlight the perspectives of donor organizations and foundations who support the development and scaling of these innovations. So if you just give me a second, I can also put the link to that event in the chat so you can sign up if you're interested. And then lastly, the first few weeks of November, the 8th through the 19th, will be the Scaling Up Community of Practice annual workshop. From what I understand, more information will be going out to everyone about that next week. But in the meantime, we thought we'd maybe use these last few minutes to get input from the Education Working Group community on what topics might be most interesting for a breakout session specifically for this Education Working Group. So of course, there's sort of cross-cutting sessions, but we also anticipate there'll be an Education Working Group session. And we'd love to just take a couple minutes here to sort of brainstorm together what topics might be most interesting to explore together. So if anyone has any ideas, thoughts off the top of your head, please feel free to throw them in the chat box, as we'd love to make sure that the next event planned is interesting to all and responding to the topics that people most want to discuss or share about. So if you have any ideas, feel free to throw them out. And then, maybe just a minute or two, other than that, we'll able to, wrap this up maybe a few minutes early, give you a few minutes back of the rest of your day. And as Jenny mentioned, we also can absolutely pull together some of these different links that everyone has shared and send them around so you have access to them all in one place. Any thoughts, any last ideas about what we might want to talk about? If not, I guess it'll be a surprise. Oh yeah, Joe, please go ahead.
Hey there, I hope you can see me there. Hi, Joe from the UK here. I am, and I couldn't use the chat, I'm sorry. I'm curious about EdTech solutions that have really given teachers some agency over the process in an open source way, so they're not just victims or mediators of EdTech, but they actually have some control over the process, the software, and so on.
Certainly a topic we could sort of do an even sort of deep dive into sort of EdTech solutions specifically in the next session, but also if anyone on the panel has any last thoughts on that topic, we have a few minutes if you want to share out some last thoughts.
Molly, it's Larry. It's not on that topic, but just one other thing I wanted to put a plug in for. It's what we're going to be talking about on Monday, but I would be glad if the Ed Working Group continued to pay some attention to it. And it's this whole notion about how things that start outside of government find their way in. And we've been trying to understand that. I think the examples from education are some of the most instructive for the entire community of practice. And so I really hope that'll continue to be an area of interest, particularly knowing some of the groups that participate in this working group, who've been associated with a number of those innovations. And I'm sure whether they've written about it or not, have thought a lot about what it takes to move something like that into the mainstream of the educational system, be that the budgetary side of getting these things on budget, or the technical side of getting curriculum accepted, or the teacher training side of really changing practices to where it's no longer an initiative, it just becomes the new normal on things. And what I've learned in working on this issue for a little while now is that it looks easier when you start than it turns out to be after the fact. That no matter how good the intervention is, for a large education system to digest it is not easy. So anything that you all have learned or would learn about that, I can promise you is not only relevant for education, but for a lot of the rest of us. And I'd really like to encourage it.
Larry, one thing to think about is Google Classrooms. I mean, that is an example, I think, of what you're looking for.
Yeah, point taken.
All right, great. Well, if we don't have any last thoughts, then I think we'll give, end a few minutes early and give you 5 minutes back in your day. But thank you everyone so much for joining and for your questions, and of course, thank you to the panelists. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you all again.